First, I'd like to start with progressive web apps. This is a term that I imagine probably most of you have heard and are fairly familiar with, but I think it can still cause quite a bit of confusion, this term, and there's still lots of different meanings that you'll hear from different people. So what meaning will I share about it? Well, probably my favorite succinct definition for it is this: web apps upgraded to be first-class apps. Alternatively, as Alex Russell said, who came up with the concept and also named it along with Francis Berryman, they're just websites that took all the right vitamins. Another quite a good way, I think, of describing them is that it's kind of the best of the web and the best of native apps. That's what we want. The best of the web being these things that we know and love about our web platform. The fact that we can write web applications that work across any platform. They're frictionless, so people can just tap a link or type in a URL and they can access this immediately. They're discoverable on any search engine, and they're open for us as developers and also for our users. We don't have any license fees to pay or profit shares to give away. Everything is open. So it would be nice if we could combine that with some of the best things about native apps, such as having a home screen icon that we can tap to load our app and have that display then in a standalone window. Have them work reliably, independent of the network conditions, and have it load instantly or near instantly from cache. And then these things aren't really core features of progressive web apps, but you can also add to that some extra features that the web has been gaining over time, like push notifications and other device features like accessing the camera. So now to share a few myths and hopefully dispel a few about progressive web apps. The first being that they're like this magic recipe, right, that no one really understands. But really, they are based on a set of web standards. So you can think of PWAs really being made up of just these three things, really. Firstly, you'll need to serve your site over HTTPS. You'll need a service worker with some basic caching. And you'll need a web app manifest that defines a few basic properties like a title and an icon. Then the other stuff that you might hear that goes along with PWAs is generally optional extra stuff, like push notifications often gets talked about in context of PWAs. The other thing that isn't on here, but that is also important with PWAs, is performance. And that's something we'll get onto a little bit later when Diego shares an example, and we'll see Lighthouse, which will score your PWA based on performance too. Next myth is that, well, these are things we already have, right? These are just a set of standards that are already there with the web. So isn't this just a buzz phrase, like just an amalgamation of things? But it's more than that, because progressive web apps get some special features if browsers recognize these traits and these technologies that are being used as part of them. So for example, on the left, this is Samsung Internet, and if it detects that you're viewing a PWA based on HTTPS service worker with basic caching, web app manifest with some basic properties, then it will dynamically switch that icon that's in the top left in the URL bar, which is normally a star for bookmarking. It will switch that for a plus icon that gives you an easy way, an easy shortcut to add that to your home screen, which is nice. Then also, depending on browser metrics around engagement and when they determine that it's a good time to display this to a user, they can also show up an add to home screen banner for you. So that's an extra way of helping users to know that they can actually add this to their home screen and to prompt them to do so. And in Android O, in Chrome now, we even have Web APK, which means that when you do add your web app to your home screen, you'll automatically get your web application wrapped as an actual native Android app, which means that it will show up, for example, in the actual apps list, and you'll be able to access actual app settings for it. So this is truly actually making your PWA a first-class app. And they're even coming to app stores. So Microsoft are already working on this, and it's beginning to happen in the Windows Insider preview, I understand. They are doing passive ingestion of PWAs into the Windows Store, which is now the Microsoft Store. So unless you opt out, and if your PWA passes their tests and they think that it's a good enough experience for people, then they can automatically pull it into their App Store. And similarly, although this hasn't happened yet, we've heard some pretty strong hints from some of the people in the Chrome team that this is something that they are looking at in terms of the Play Store as well. So of course, it's the web, so you don't necessarily need your web apps to be in these app stores, but it can be a pretty nice thing for them to be there as well for that extra discoverability. If people are looking for apps, then maybe they're going to be looking in these app stores, so it's quite nice that it will surface up there too. Myth 3 is that PWAs are only, skipped ahead. They're only really useful if you're interested in making an offline application. And if you don't have any particular requirements around offline usage, then maybe you don't really need to worry about it. But actually, the real thing about progressive web apps and service workers and caching is that it gives you reliability to have your site, your app work independent of those network conditions, and you don't have to worry about Li-Fi and being in Clapham Junction and not having a signal. And everyone needs reliability. That's what PWAs can give us. Myth 4, we do see this sometimes from certain tech publications. PWAs are a Google brand, or they're a Google-only thing, or they're Google PWAs. But really, they're a cross-browser collaboration, as demonstrated here nicely at the PWA Dev Summit, which was in Amsterdam last year, when some of our Samsung colleagues were on stage with Google and Mozilla and Microsoft and Opera. And so, yeah, it's just like web standards themselves are a cross-browser collaboration, progressive web apps are too. Myth 5, PWAs are not ready yet because they're not on iOS, right? Although we did have the good news recently that Apple have actually put service workers officially in development in Safari. So it's progressing. But you might think of this as, well, they're not on iOS, so they're not really here yet. Well, actually, a whole bunch of organizations, big organizations like these and many others are embracing PWAs and making their sites PWAs already, or making new sites that are PWAs. And you might have come across some of these. So people are doing it now, and you can do this quite safely with progressive enhancement. You can have your app, your site work just as it would do normally on iOS, and on Android or other platforms where it has support for these extra features, you can use those and make the most of them. The last myth is that PWAs are just a mobile thing. So it's only for mobile apps. But actually, we will see that they're also for desktop. For example, so this is Samsung Internet on DeX, which is our little docking station that you can plug your keyboard and mouse into and turn your mobile phone into a desktop experience. And this is showing that you have PWAs on desktop too. So just like in the mobile version of Samsung Internet, you have a little plus icon there if it's PWA, and you can do add to home screen. And so in this case, add to home screen adds a desktop icon. And when you load it from there, you have a standalone application, like a native app. Let's just go back to present. Also, desktop, these kind of features are coming to Chrome OS and also Edge as well. And not just mobile and desktop, but virtual reality too. And that's what we're going to be sharing a bit more about today, because if you are developing a virtual reality web application, then why wouldn't you also want to take advantage of some of these great features of progressive web apps too? So as Dan Scott shared, who wrote a blog post about this, what if I could just escape into my lovely virtual reality scene wherever I am without worrying about connectivity or how long it would take to download? So this brings us on to progressive WebVR apps. And at this point, I'm going to do a a quick microphone switch here with Diego.
So Peter has given us a great introduction into progressive web apps. What we're going to see now is a special demo that we prepared for today. Unlike the one that we had last JS Monthly, where we had a bit of an issue with illegal panda cloning that happened on stage. Right now, we needed a PWA that was iconic. We actually looked for many hours what was the PWA that was going to make the cut. And of course, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this logo over here. Can I see some hands? Yes, the famous air horner by Paul Kinlan. So, he is already informed and he actually approves the WebVR version of the air horner. So, not going to spoil it. I think you already know what's coming, but the meetup is going to get a bit loud. What we want to do is we want to take the air horner and we want to upgrade it to the next generation of the web, which is pretty much VR. So the past probably day and a half, we were working very, very hard in order to get to you the air horner. If you guys want to go to if you all want to go to the link and see the air horner, you are going to be able to see how it has evolved. Probably you're not going to see many changes at first, but just wait and see because it is magical. This changes absolutely everything about PWAs again. So what we're doing is pretty much that we are using PWA technologies, which Peter has explained, to cache audio, the very famous audio from the air horn. We are using a splash screen to load or play audio. This is basically a trick that we're doing because we need the application to be able to play audio. And in some browsers, like mobile browsers, you actually need to register user input first. And then we are attaching animations to events. So when you load the application, once you go into start, you're going to run into a web page that looks more or less like the initial air horn, except then it goes crazy 3D. And it's magical. So what we are having is, again, all the benefits that Peter described, like, yeah, there you go. That's what I wanted to hear. Great, thanks. So we have an icon on the home screen. We have the application per se, and we actually tested that this application works in different types of browsers, including VR browsers. Here we have a screenshot of how the web page looks inside the Samsung Gear VR browser, and I've actually loaded here. I'm just gonna go in VR and go into the start and the immersive mode. Now I'm just going to give the headset to some lucky person in the audience and feel free to tap away. This was something that we did in the course of a day and a half. We did run this earlier today, like 2 hours ago, on Lighthouse to see if we were not failing epically. And it turns out that we scored quite well in the progressive web app. Now, the website, my website, is not automatically redirecting to HTTPS, so there are things that, I know, shame, right? A bit of shame, I know, and I'm sorry, I'm very sorry for that. But we can see that the part that was most impacted was performance. Now here it has to do with the script. The A-frame is kind of like stopping the rendering because it needs to, of course, create the 3D elements, etc., etc. But nonetheless, I think it's quite good. Yes? Can we get some approval from you? Yeah, amazing. Great. Okay, so now that we've seen a basic example of how we've taken a WebVR experience that's running on, of course, on the browser, then we decided to test it. Okay, it needs to run in mobile phones, and it is running on mobile phones. You've seen it in your devices when you actually started tapping. We tested it in 3 degrees of freedom devices, and if anyone wants to try it out in VR, it's quite basic, but if anyone wants to see that it actually works, please feel free to ask Peter for the headset. We have it running on 3 degrees of freedom or just orientation with the tapping here. Before coming here, we actually tested it on an Oculus Rift, and it is actually working. The problem is that we didn't implement anything to actually tap. You know that when you have the Gear VR, you can tap and it represents a click. When you go on the phone, if you tap the screen, it represents a click. No worries. On the Oculus Rift, we actually needed to create this click event because it doesn't have any touchpad or anything that triggers the event. Then again, it's probably one of the tips that Peter is going to show us following, which would be related to progressive enhancement and making sure that an experience works across different types of devices. So that would be for the Air Horner VR 2.0 version next reloaded. So that's it for the example. The code is already on GitHub. We are going to share the code and the slides. And Peter is going to give us some tips on how can we mix PWA technology with WebVR to create these type of very engaging and amazing experiences.
We're coming to the end of the presentation, but I wanted to share a few more thoughts about the progressive part of these progressive WebVR apps. Starting with a great video by Arturo, if this will load, because I think this really shows it well, and some of you might have seen this animation already about how you can have these experiences that work as normal in normal browsers and mobile devices as we're used to. You can also have what we call a magic window effect, where you're using the accelerometer of the device and you can see different parts of the 3D scene by moving it around. And you can have this going up into the higher end devices, and it works then with devices like Daydream and the Samsung Gear VR, and then even going up into the higher end devices, which it cut off at the end, but things like the Rift and the Vive. And so the idea is that you should really focus on that initial mobile low-end device and then progressively enhance to build up more functionality for those other devices too. So virtual reality is not an excuse to make people wait. You might think that, well, people are going to love my VR experience, my VR Air Horner. I'm sure people would wait for that, but maybe not that long. But really, you're still not going to have very long before people give up and go, I'll try something else or come back to it later, and then never do. So it's best to get things on screen, get the first part of the experience up in front of people as soon as possible. One way you can do this is there's a model of Call of Duty assets demo from Play Canvas. Hopefully this slide doesn't look too threatening, sorry about that. This is not saying download higher res as is post load, sorry. But it's to share their example where they are initially loading low-res assets, low-res textures. So you get to see this model as soon as possible. And then once it's loaded up, it's then downloading, it's streaming down the higher resolution textures, and then it overwrites them, replaces those on the fly, which means that as you're viewing this, probably by the time you then start to zoom in and look around this model, you probably have by then got the higher res assets in anyway, and then you'll be able to see the higher res version. We also like to talk about this concept of continuous browsing experiences, because you don't necessarily have to just think of your app as being a VR app. It can be a mobile app which has a VR element to it. So you could imagine that people are viewing your page or your application on a mobile phone, and then maybe there's some part of that says, hey, there's actually a virtual reality part of this experience that you can try. So they go, okay, yeah, I'd like to do that. So they slot it in their virtual reality headset, and in Samsung Internet that will then make it load automatically in the Samsung Internet for Gear VR in the virtual reality browser. And then they can experience their virtual reality version, and then once they've finished, they can take it out and they're back to the mobile experience again. As an example, sorry, we could turn the sound down now, couldn't we?
Turn it down here.
Thank you. So, as an example, imagine you were reading an article about the NASDAQ stock price and whether there might be another bubble again. But it's kind of, you could read about this, but you might not really feel it, you might not really experience it. So imagine if then you try out the NASDAQ roller coaster, which lets you actually take a ride on this stock price, and then you actually really get to feel the ups and downs, right? And it was an experiment by the Wall Street Journal, and it was more just to try out a concept, but they had a really good reaction to this. People were saying things like, I never would have bothered to read an article about this, but this really brought it to life for me. This is the scary bit, when It's also important to remember that in these virtual reality browsers, our 2D sites, our applications that we have already, they'll still continue to work as they are, because these VR browsers, even though you're in a 360 environment, you have a web browser window. You'll have a 2D, essentially, window that you can still view your content as normal. You're just getting me back from before. And you can use the virtual keyboard, or you can use voice input even to interact with it. Then finally, it's interesting to think about this third axis itself as being a kind of progressive enhancement. So imagine if you had your regular website and you had your HTML and CSS, and then just by adding some extra CSS 3D properties, you could then take advantage of that third dimension. This is a concept that has been talked about a lot, and there's been some initial work gone into it, but at the moment, this is not something that's available in the web. At the moment, to do WebVR apps, we need to have a separate WebGL canvas. Although with libraries like A-Frame, that's starting to get us more towards this really nice progressive enhancement model, because it is actually letting you write HTML. But hopefully in the future, we might also have this CSS 3D enhancement and be able to really easily progressively enhance our sites to take advantage of 3D. So with some of these things, it is kind of early days for virtual reality on the web, but we are progressing. Sorry. I think at that point, I probably should just end this and say, thank you very much.